We've been told for decades now to limit the amount of saturated fat that we eat because it's claimed it causes heart disease. But take a look at these graphs. Do you see any correlation between the amount of heart disease deaths and saturated fat over the last century? No. It's time to debunk the saturated fat myth. Not everyone wants you to know the truth, so I'm here to expose the science and share practical tips on weight loss, fitness, and healthy lifestyle. It's simply put with no BS. Make sure you're subscribed. I'm MISGUIDED, the Norwegian Viking. Now, saturated fat. We know it's bad for us. We've been told this for decades now. We've been told that it causes heart disease, so we need to limit saturated fat. The Dietary Guidelines, for instance, specifically say to limit saturated fat to less than 10% of our calories. But what if it's not true? What if there's no real evidence that saturated fat causes heart disease? I get that it's difficult to imagine even because we've been told for so long by authorities that it's bad for us. But still, just imagine that it's not true. The dietary guideline recommendations are supposed to tell us what a healthy diet looks like. And a lot of people change their diet based on these recommendations. And they're also the basis of the diets that are offered in certain institutions, like schools, cafeteria, care homes, prisons. So it's very important that they reflect what an actual healthy diet looks like. And if you were to base your diet on these recommendations, you would probably want these recommendations to be based on science, right? So let's see if they really are based on science. First, let's go back to the graphs that I showed in the very beginning. There's a lot more to this than graphs, and we'll take a look at that later on. However, it's important to note that even if there was an association, it wouldn't really prove anything because association by itself does not prove cause and effect. Just as an illustration, think about this. When the weather is nice and warm, more people will probably go out swimming, even in the ocean where there might be sharks. So the number of shark attacks will probably go up when the weather is nice. What else increases when the weather is nice? The amount of ice cream we eat. No, this is just to illustrate a point, and we'll get back to saturated fat and heart disease shortly. So here's the thing, there might be an association between the number of shark attacks and the amount of ice cream we eat. However, I think we can safely say that shark attacks do not cause us to eat more ice cream, and eating ice cream does not cause shark attacks. So there can be an association without one thing causing the other to happen. And now let's imagine that more sharks attack during bad weather. So even though we might go in the water more often when it's nice weather, more shark attacks actually happen in bad weather. But we still eat more ice cream when it's nice weather. In this case, we can safely say that shark attacks do not cause us to eat more ice cream. And eating ice cream does not cause shark attacks because there's not even an association. Now, note that I have not looked up the statistics on ice cream or shark attacks. This is just as an illustration. So here's the thing, let's get back to saturated fat and heart disease. For saturated fat to cause heart disease, there really has to be an association between the two of them. And from the graphs that we looked at previously, there really doesn't seem to be any correlation. Now, the saturated fat data from this graph is based on food availability per capita. All of this is based on US data, by the way. Now, to my knowledge, loss due to spoilage, for instance, and other things have not been taken into account within this data. But this was the best data I could find for such a long period of time. And I think we can assume that the trend, the graph of our actual consumption of saturated fat wouldn't differ much from the graph that I just showed you. The graph of heart disease deaths is taken from this paper with statistics from National Heart and Lung and Blood Institute. Now note that these are heart disease deaths in general, and there are different types of heart diseases. The type of heart disease that's claimed to be caused by saturated fat is coronary heart disease, which wasn't really in the picture, wasn't really recorded until the 1950s, and might have even been completely absent in the early 1900s, which again doesn't really match with our saturated fat intake. Let's look at a few more associations before taking a look at more rigorous research, because we cannot really prove any cause and effect with an association, but for there to really be a cause and effect, there has to be an association at least. Now, saturated fat intake is actually said to have decreased over the last few decades. And if we take a look at data published on CDC's website, we can see how saturated fat intake as a percentage of our total calories consumed has changed from 1971 to 2016. And this could make us think that the decline in heart disease is due to lower saturated fat intake. However, these data are based on surveys of people who had to recall what they had been eating for a certain amount of time. Not sure for how long, how many people were surveyed, and whether they are a good representation of the general population. So the accuracy of the data is questionable, so are most of the other data. So we just have to make the best of what we have available. Also note that this shows a saturated fat intake as a percentage of the total calories consumed. This is important. Here's an illustration. Let's say that for one full day, the only thing that you eat is one orange. That one orange constitutes 100% of your diet that day. The next day, you eat one orange and one apple. Now, let's say for the sake of this argument that the apple and the orange contain the same amount of calories. For this day, the orange constitutes 50% of the diet. Now, the next day, you eat one orange and two apples, and the orange constitutes only 33% of the total diet. But note that you eat the same amount of orange each day. So the percentage of the total diet went down, but the amount that you actually ate stayed the same. So when it comes to saturated fat, the percentage of saturated fat that we consume compared to the whole diet may have decreased, but the total calories that we consume has actually increased. So the amount of saturated fat that we consume may have been the same in 1971 as it is today. Now, I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying that it's very important to be aware of these things when looking at these type of numbers. Now, I do not have the total calories consumed for each of these surveys, though I do have it for the first few years. So if you do the calculation, the difference in the amount of calories coming from saturated fat in 71 to 74 is only 30 calories higher than in 88 to 94, which accounts for basically that whole drop. 30 calories is nothing, especially when taking into account that these data come from surveys of people recalling what they have been eating for a certain amount of time. This type of data is very inaccurate. So the drop in calories may even have been part of the error. We do not know. Now, the CDC claims that the percentage of adults consuming a diet low in saturated fat increased from 25% to 41% from the late 1970s through 1988 to 94, and that no significant changes in the percentage of adults consuming a diet low in saturated fat were observed from 88 to 94 through 2007 to 2010. You can look at the green curve here. However, heart disease deaths decreased quite a bit between 88 and 2010. Of course, there may be different reasons for that. We might have been gotten better at treating heart disease, for instance. But do you see how this just doesn't really fit into the narrative that saturated fat is the thing to blame for heart disease? Even if we did consume less saturated fat now and heart disease deaths decreased the way it did, why did it increase so much in the past mid-century? Now, again, these are only associations, so now let's look at what actual studies have shown. As a reminder, the reason we're talking about this is because we have been told for so long to limit saturated fat intake because it presumably causes heart disease. Many countries around the world are telling their citizens to do this through dietary guideline recommendations. If these recommendations are not based on strong, sound evidence, they shouldn't really be making these recommendations, in my opinion. By the way, if you enjoy this kind of no BS, give it to you straight kind of videos on weight loss, fitness and healthy lifestyle, make sure you subscribe to my channel, and also remember to follow me on Instagram at VikingIngun. Now let's look at some studies. First, it's important to understand that there are different types of studies. You have epidemiological studies that show associations, and as we talked about earlier, that means they cannot prove causation. Then you have randomized clinical trials that are kind of the golden standard that can potentially show cause and effect, though they need to be performed and analyzed carefully since they can of course have many flaws as well as many limitations. You also have review studies that analyze previous studies to see if they together provide strong evidence. These can be very valuable, though they can also have flaws because they require the authors to do analysis that can turn out to be biased. For instance, they need to select the studies that they're going to analyze. Let's look at some review studies of randomized clinical trials substituting saturated fat for unsaturated fat. Let's look at a review from the American Heart Association from 2017, which says that we conclude strongly that lowering intake of saturated fat and replacing it with unsaturated fats, especially polyunsaturated fats, will lower the incidence of cardiovascular disease. Now, this might not have been what you expected me to share with you right now, though take a look at these conflicts of interest. These are declared next to the article. That is pretty clear conflict of interest. On top of that, according to some, the few studies that the American Heart Association decided to include in their review are highly questionable poor studies. Now, it would be too much to go into detail about all of that in this video though. Now, listen. It makes sense to believe that experts and professionals know what they're talking about, and that an organization called the American Heart Association knows what increases the risk of heart disease. If they say saturated fat causes heart disease, it must be true, right? And we shouldn't even question it. And that's the danger. We should always question. The people behind the American Heart Association are people, just like you and I. They have flaws, just like you and I, and they might be influenced. That does not mean we should disregard what they say. Of course not. But we should question it, just like we would question anything else, and we should look for the evidence. And luckily, there have been quite a few other reviews of randomized clinical trials substituting saturated fat for unsaturated fat. Let's look at a few. This one said that the present systematic review provides no evidence for the beneficial effects of reduced or modified fat diets in the secondary prevention of coronary heart disease, recommending higher intake of polyunsaturated fatty acids in replacement of saturated fatty acids was not associated with risk reduction. And this one said that available evidence from randomized controlled trials provides no indication of benefit on coronary heart disease or all-cause mortality for replacing saturated fat with linoleic acid-rich vegetable oils. And this one said that, in conclusion, available evidence from adequately controlled randomized trials suggests replacing saturated fat with mostly N6 PUFA is unlikely to reduce coronary heart disease events, coronary heart disease mortality, or total mortality. The suggestion of benefits reported in earlier meta-analysis is due to the inclusion of inadequately controlled trials. This last one says that only by including inadequate studies could you arrive at the same recommendations that the American Heart Association recommends. There is a review that actually agrees with the American Heart Association, though the list of conflict of interests is so long that I think we should be highly skeptical. Also, Zoe Harcombe, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, did a massive review of not only randomized controlled trials, but also prospective cohort studies, a different type of study. She reviewed what evidence was available back in the 70s when the first dietary guideline recommendations were put in place, as well as what is available now, or when she published the article. What she found was that the RCT and PC evidence available to the dietary committees did not support the introduction of the dietary fat guidelines. That includes both limiting saturated fat but also total fat intake. and that the RCT and PC evidence currently available does not support extent recommendations, meaning current recommendations. Furthermore, the quality of the evidence is so poor that it could not be relied on had it provided support. Now I'm going to mention one more study. Last year, a massive review came out. Actually, it's an update on the previous one. It's an almost 300-page report, and they found that reducing saturated fat had no significant effect on total mortality, cardiovascular disease mortality, coronary heart disease mortality, fatal heart attacks, non-fatal heart attacks, coronary heart disease events, and strokes. They do claim there's an increase in cardiovascular disease events, though as Zoe Harkenby explains on her website, when they removed studies where they aimed to reduce saturated fat but didn't, this finding ceased to be significant. And this analysis is done within the report. So really, once again, even with this massive review, they didn't find anything. Now, of course, we should listen to what experts say, though we should also question it, and we should look for the evidence. We should demand that there actually is evidence if we're going to change our diet based on these recommendations. And not only that, it needs to make sense, and we'll get back to that shortly. Now, when it comes to the American Dietary Guidelines, they have actually, in a way, admitted that they have been wrong about other things in the past. For instance, there used to be a recommendation for limiting foods high in cholesterol because they thought that was bad. Well, turns out there's no real evidence for that. So now that recommendation has been removed. They're still holding on to the recommendation about saturated fat, however, even though, once again, there's no real evidence that it causes heart disease. And it doesn't even make sense that it would. Saturated fat is a natural part of our diet. It has been since the very beginning of our existence. Actually, all foods that contain fat contain a mixture of the three types of fat: saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, and polyunsaturated fat. Now, where do we get the most unsaturated fat? In animal foods, which we have been eating since the very beginning of our existence. Actually, the fat in breast milk, which is of course the only thing babies eat in their crucial beginning of their life after they're born, can contain as much as 50% saturated fat. Now, nature wouldn't do that to us if it was truly bad for us, right? Where do we get the most unsaturated fats, especially the polyunsaturated fats? From man-made vegetable or seed oils, which hasn't really been around for more than a century, really. And some things don't even make sense when comparing foods that we're told to eat with foods that we're told to avoid. For instance, 100 grams of sirloin steak has less saturated fat, and total fat for that matter, than mackerel fish. And we're told to eat fatty fish, but not to eat red meat because of saturated fat. The 100 grams of sirloin steak also contains less saturated fat than 1.5 tablespoons of olive oil, which we could easily eat in a salad. Now, whenever we do want to change our diet, if we want to limit a nutrient or a food, it's very important what we substitute that food or nutrient with. For instance, if you want to limit saturated fat, you could substitute it with different types of fat. For instance, the American Heart Association suggests or advocates for polyunsaturated fats specifically. Again, polyunsaturated fats are very high in vegetable or seed oils. That's really where we get most of our polyunsaturated fats in our diet. However, vegetable oils or seed oils are completely unnatural in a human's diet. This is super important, and I'll come back to this in a separate video. I personally try to avoid these oils as much as possible. Now, for those that want to eat low fat in general, not just saturated fat, but low fat in general, it's important to remember that low fat foods often substitute fat for sugar, for instance. So don't simply assume that just because it's low fat, it's healthy. Now, to sum it all up, there's no real evidence that saturated fat is bad for us. I think it's crucial for people to know what the science says. The good science. If we look at the science and use common sense, we'll no longer be victims of bad nutrition advice, and we'll have the knowledge to build the best diet for ourselves. So I hope you enjoy these videos. Make sure you subscribe for more. And of course, if you haven't already done so, make sure you download my free guide called Hack Your Way Out of 3 Weight Loss Mistakes Almost Everyone Makes. Again, there's a lot of bad advice out there, not based on science, like we've seen in this video. So make sure you base everything on science. Download this free guide right now to hack your way out of these mistakes, common mistakes. Download it at vikingingun.com right now. It's free. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I would really appreciate a thumbs up, a heart, or a like, depending on where you're watching from. And I'll see you in the next video.